Norm MacDonald. And at 8 p.m. Eastern, book notes. Author David Horowitz discusses his book, Radical Son, A Generational Odyssey.
I said the police will be looking the Panthers. We believe.
Now, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of the Natural Resources Defense Council, former Vice President Dan. Over the next hour and 45 minutes, they'll debate the effects of environmental protection on the economy. This event was held at Pacifica University in Oregon earlier this year.
Ladies and gentlemen, the president of Pacific University, Dr. Quayle.
Good evening and welcome to the 15th anniversary Tom McCall Forum. The Tom McCall Forum has become a genuine tradition in Oregon public life, and we try a strong addition to the political dialogue in our state. Undoubtedly, there are quite a few here in this audience who have many forums over the years, and we welcome you back. Tonight's program promises to be among the most timely and the most engaging of all of our forums. It seems fitting that on the occasion of the forum's 15th anniversary, we should turn to a discussion of the environment and its relationship to economic progress, a subject that thoroughly captured the attention and tested the imagination of Tom McCall during his years as governor. To help us sort through these complex issues, we have called upon two well-known and highly regarded political leaders, former Vice President Dan Quayle and environmental attorney Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. We expect their dialogue to illuminate many critical facets of this topic as they explore it from two very different perspectives. I am also pleased to welcome once again a national television audience to share the Tom McCall Forum. For the third year, C-SPAN is covering this event, and it will broadcast the McCall Forum in its entirety in the next few days. To direct tonight's forum discussion, I would like to introduce Mindy Cameron, the editorial page editor of the Seattle Times and a graduate of Pacific University. This is the fourth year Mindy Cameron will serve forum moderator. She is a member of the Board of Trustees of Pacific University and chairs our Advancement Committee. The past 15 years of McCall Forums have witnessed a great deal of spirited discussion. Pacific is proud to be able to host this wonderful civic and educational adventure. Thank you all once and for all and for coming. We'd like you to welcome our guests, and I'd like to welcome Mindy Cameron.
Thank you, Faith, and good evening. And I want to add my welcome to Faith at this 15th anniversary of the Tom McCall Forum, and also to welcome our C-SPAN audience once again. First, here's what you can expect tonight. Vice President Dan Quayle and Robert Kennedy Jr. will have about 15 minutes opening statements, and then we'll turn to a panel that you'll meet in just a moment for several rounds of questions. Panelists have promised to keep their questions brief, and Mr. Kennedy and Vice President Quayle will have 2 minutes to respond and 1 minute for a follow-up if there is any. Finally, there will be an opportunity for audience participation. You get to ask some questions. I'll tell you more about how that's going to work when we get to the point. First, Jennifer Murray is from Helena, Montana. She's a senior majoring in political science and creative writing. She's treasurer of the Politics and Law Forum. She was first exposed to politics by her father, who is a county commissioner. She is just thinking right now about attending law school as preparation for a career in local government. Joining her is Dan James, also a Montana native. He graduated from Pacific in 1987 with a bachelor's in political science. For the past 5 years, he has served as the Federal Affairs Representative of the Pacific Northwest Waterways Association, headquartered in Vancouver, Washington. Prior to his current position, Dan worked for 3 years on the Washington, D.C. staff of Representative Les Aucoin. And finally, Seth Singleton is a professor of politics and government at Pacific. He is a graduate of Harvard College and his doctorate is from Yale. His specialty is international relations. He has taught in Africa, Canada, and Russia, and has served as dean of Pearson College at Yale and also of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Pacific. And he was the first academic dean of the Universidad Espiritu in Guayaquil, Ecuador. Thank you, panelists. I'll join you in just a moment. Now to introduce our first very special guest is Craig Allen. His hometown is Grants Pass, Oregon, where he is currently a senior at Pacific, a political science major. He is vice president of the Politics and Law Forum. He is currently interning in Senator Brady Adams' office in Salem. He enjoys playing soccer and talking politics.
His quote, "Good environmental policy 100% of the time is identical to good economic policy," goes a long way towards explaining the priorities of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. He sees the care and upkeep of the environment not as a duty or chore, but as an investment in our future prosperity. Although born in a family which over the last half-century has become an American political dynasty, the man I introduced you tonight has succeeded in distinguishing himself in his own right, not through service in elected office, but through his unwavering commitment to the environment. As the chief prosecuting attorney for the New York-based Hudson River Keeper, a coalition of fishermen and others who want to clean up and protect the Hudson River, he has successfully litigated or settled over 80 suits against major corporate and municipal defendants. He is also a senior attorney for the Natural Resources and Defense Council, a national lobbying and litigation organization. Beyond these duties, Mr. Kennedy teaches environmental law as a professor at Pace University. Mr. Kennedy has up to this point mostly shunned the limelight, preferring to act behind the scenes instead of directly in the public eye. He has been involved in several prominent campaigns, including that of Mario Cuomo in 1994, as well as those of numerous Kennedy family members. His reluctance to run himself has not put a damper on his political effectiveness, nor his ability to be bipartisan in his efforts. After Cuomo's election in '94, Kennedy joined forces with Cuomo's successor, George Pataki, to unveil a breakthrough agreement that allowed New York City to control the watershed land surrounding New York's upstate reservoir system. Although he has yet to run for political office, he often displays a generic family campaign button, perhaps as a harbinger of things still to come. Developed during the '94 elections when he had no less than 5 relatives seeking elected office, it reads, vote for the nearest you." Perhaps soon he too will be one of those Kennedys running for an office near you. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Robert F. Kennedy.
Did a great job. Very good. Thank you very much.
And here to introduce former Vice President Dan Quayle is Jeremy Waddell. His hometown is Astoria, Oregon. He is a junior, also a political science major, and he is president of the Politics and Law Forum. He is currently interning in Senator Gary George's office in Salem. His political heroes are Abraham Lincoln, F. Buckley, and Ronald Reagan. He is a member of the cross-country team. Jeremy?
Thank you. His remarkable career of achievement began at the age of 29 when he defied the political odds makers and defeated an 8-term congressman. At age 33, he became the youngest senator ever from the state of Indiana. At age 41, he became the first member of his generation to hold a national public office by being elected Vice President of the United States of America. And finally, at age 53, James Danforth Quayle was sworn in as President of the United States. Oh, but I'm ahead of myself. As senator, he gained respect from both sides of the aisle for his diligent committee work and his collaboration with Senator Edward Kennedy to produce the Job Training Partnership Act, perhaps the most important piece of social legislation of the Reagan presidency. He made official visits to 47 countries, was chair of the National Space Council, and was an important voice for President Bush on Capitol Hill. His most substantial role, though, was as chair of the President's Council on Competitiveness. Conservatives and business leaders had high praise for his emphasis on balancing environmental protection with equal concern for economic growth. In his memoirs, he summed up his position saying, "We won't have the wealth to undertake the legitimate environmental cleanups and protections we all care about." He currently is a nationally syndicated columnist, serves on a number of corporate boards, and is the author of 2 books, Standing Firm, a best-selling vice presidential memoir, and The American Family, Discovering the Values That Make Us Strong. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to introduce to you tonight former Vice President Dan Quayle.
We'll begin the forum now, and Mr. Kennedy, the first 15 minutes are yours.
Thank you for the opportunity to come to Portland. This is one of my favorite cities. I have 2 cousins who live out here actually in the gorge, and they're windsurfers. And I think at least one of them's here tonight, so I'm hoping to run into them after this. Tomorrow I'm going to be doing a fundraiser for the Willamette Riverkeeper, which is a program that's modeled on the one for which I work. On the Hudson. I work for a group called the Hudson Riverkeeper, which was started in the 60s as a coalition. It used to be the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, a coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen that got together to protect the Hudson, which was for many of them the source of their livelihood and many of their recreational values. And I bring lawsuits. They have a patrol boat that goes up and down the river looking for polluters, and I bring lawsuits against those polluters with my students at Pace University Law School. This is part of a long tradition on the Hudson River. If you look at a typical environmental law book in this country, you'll see that case after case, the seminal primal cases in environmental law in this country, many of them are Hudson River cases. We've been blessed for many years with an extremely vigorous and aggressive and sophisticated environmental community that was willing to use the environmental laws that Congress gave us to defend their local communities. And as a result of that today, the Hudson is regarded by many as the richest water system in the world. It produces more biomass per gallon than any other water body on Earth. Well, this year, I love my job, and I love going to court, and I love fighting against the bad guys, and I love being with the fishermen. But this year, my clients asked me to, 2 years ago, my clients asked me to do something different, which I never really wanted to do, which was to spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C., lobbying against the anti-environmental provisions of the 104th Congress. They saw those provisions as the greatest threat to their livelihood rather than any specific Hudson River pollution. And they were right. If the laws that passed Congress during the 104th Congress, which was the most anti-environmental Congress in our nation's history, had actually been signed into law by the President, we would have no real enforceable environmental law. The principal laws that protect our water and our air and endangered species would be unenforceable today. We would still have many of them on the books, but it would be like Mexico, where they have wonderful environmental laws, but nobody knows about them because they're unenforceable. The worst provisions were concealed in the Contract for America in laws that are called super mandates. And a super mandate is a law that can repeal or amend an entire body of laws without going back and debating those individually. The most famous and one of the worst was the so-called Takings Bill, which purported to protect private property, but what it really did was give constitutional protection to the right to pollute. The worst of all of them was the so-called Regulatory Reform Bill, and they all had wonderful names, the platitudes the American people could embrace, because we all want to reduce the burden of regulation. But if you read the fine print of that statute, what it really did was provide a very complex legal mechanism that gave corporate polluters veto power over all of our environmental health and safety regulations. They also attacked our existing environmental law directly. The Clean Water Act was rewritten so to remove virtually all federal protection from wetlands and to lift many of the restrictions on dumping toxics and sewage into our nation's waterways. The Endangered Species Act was rewritten so that species would only receive protection from extinction if they could demonstrate a current economic value that exceeded the financial benefit of destroying them. The Superfund law was rewritten so that polluters would no longer have to clean up after themselves, but instead you and I, the federal taxpayer, would have to pay those bills, so on and so on. Now, if the people on Capitol Hill were promoting this legislation, and that's exactly what I've done for the last couple of years, why are you doing this? What they invariably would say is that the time has come in our nation where we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. And that is a false choice. In every case, good environmental policy is critical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generation. If, on the other hand, we want to do what they're urging us to do on Capitol Hill, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, to convert all of our natural resources to cash, to have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow, and we can generate the illusion of a prosperous economy. Children are going to pay for our joyride, with denuded landscapes and huge cleanup costs that they simply won't be able to afford. And if you don't believe that, if you have doubts about that, look at what happened to the nations that didn't invest in the environment in 1970 the way that we did. All of our environmental investment began in Earth Day 1970. And I remember what it was like before Earth Day. I remember the Anadrom's peregrine, the eastern Anadroms, the most beautiful subspecies of peregrine that we had in this country, went extinct. The snowy egret, the brown pelican, dozens of other birds, including the bald eagle, were on their way to extinction. We had thousands of Americans dying in our cities because of smog events every year. And the was burning for days and couldn't be put out. And people forget about that today. And on Earth Day 1970, 10% of our population, 20 million people, came out on the streets and demanded that our political leaders restore our ancient environmental rights that had been taken from us during the last half century. And within the next 10 years, a bipartisan effort, we passed 19 major federal environmental laws that are now the jewel of environmental statutes all over the world. We're the envy of the rest of the world, and Congress is trying to dismantle them. But look at the nation that didn't make that investment in 1970. Look at the former Soviet Union, where the Aral Sea, they didn't have NEPA, they didn't have an environmental impact statement requirement. And the Aral Sea, which is the largest inland waterway, freshwater body on Earth, the Great Lakes, is now a desert. They didn't have a Clean Water Act, and the Sea of in Russia, the second most productive water body on Earth after the Chesapeake, is now a biological wasteland. They didn't have a nuclear regulatory review requirement, and 1/5 of the state of Belarus, a state the size of Oregon, is now permanently uninhabitable because of radiation. In Turkey, where I was a month and a half ago, Clean Water Act, and they've lost 300 species in the Marmara Sea in the last 15 or 20 years, and the Black Sea will be dead within 20. I was in Thailand 2 months ago, and in Bangkok, they don't have a Clean Air Act. And on every street, you see people wearing masks. The New York Times reported recently that the average child in Bangkok, a city larger than New York, who reaches the age of 6, has permanently lost 7 IQ points because of the density of lead in the air, because they didn't have a Clean Air Act that said you got to get the lead out of the gasoline. In Mexico City, if you own a car, you drive it 3.5 days a week, because they don't have a Clean Air Act that's enforceable. And their major state industries have to shut down for weeks at a time when they have a smog inversion, and they lose thousands of lives every year in Mexico City. Pollution. In those nations, environmental injury has led to economic catastrophe. What would have happened here if we hadn't passed these environmental laws, and that's what's going to happen if we go ahead and dismantle them. And what part of my job in the last 2 years was just going around and confronting people who make this argument that environmental laws are a diminishment of our nation's wealth. They don't diminish our nation's wealth. They're an investment in infrastructure, the same as in road construction or telecommunications. You have to do it because they're the underpinnings of a sound economy. The other thing that they like to say is, what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to return control to the states. We want local control. We got to get it out of the federal government. But what they're really talking about is corporate control. And we remember in the Hudson Valley the 1960s version of local control, where General Electric could come into a town like Glens Falls, New York, and tell people there, we're going to bring you a spanking factory and 1,000 new jobs, and we're going to raise your tax base, and all you have to do is waive your environmental laws and let us dump our PCBs into the Hudson River. And if you don't do it, we're moving to New Jersey. And Glens Falls took the deal, and then 20 years later, General Electric left the Hudson Valley, and its pockets were stuffed with cash. And it left behind a $280 million cleanup bill that nobody could afford. And it took all of its jobs with it, and it left 1,200 fishermen, my clients, out of work. And the Hudson River is loaded with fish, but we can't use them. We can't eat them because they're filled with General Electric's poison. And every woman between Oswego, New York, and Albany has elevated levels of PCB in her breast. And every one of you in this audience has PCBs in your body, from General Electric or some other producer who did the same thing to the locality. And what federal laws did was the first time they said, we're not going to allow this kind of corporate blackmail. We're not going to allow these corporations to whipsaw one community in New Jersey against another in New York, or one in Oregon against another in California. We're going to level the playing field, and we're not going to allow these corporations to blackmail these communities into ransoming their children's future for a few years of nation-based prosperity. Federal laws are the ones that gave communities the power for the first time to stand up to the corporations. And that's what these are about. The other thing that they love to say is that what we're really trying to do is restore the free market economy, because that's what made America great. But they don't really want a free market economy. The best thing that could happen to the environment is if we had a true free market economy. If you look around you, the most egregious environmental injury comes not from the free economy, but from the suspension of free market rules, from somebody who's not obeying the environmental laws, from somebody who's using political clout to get a subsidy, to escape the discipline of the free market. Look at all the resource issues that you have out here in the Pacific Northwest that have driven the environmental movement in this country for the last 20 or 30 years. Water and grazing and mining and timber. They're all about subsidy. About somebody who's getting a resource underpriced or for free, and so they're wasting it. If you're a farmer in the state of Idaho and you want federal water, you can get unlimited amounts for 19 cents an acre foot. If we left that water in the river to go over the dams or sold it to the city of Los Angeles, it has a value of $300 an acre foot. So we're giving you a $299 subsidy because you get the resource for free, you use it wastefully, you grow rice in the desert, you put the Louisiana rice farmers out of business, and you've sucked the rivers in Idaho dry, and there hasn't been a salmon season in Idaho in 15 years. The same with grazing, where if you want to graze a cow and a calf on my private land, you're going to pay $18 a month. But the federal land, if you want to graze it on our land that you and I own, you pay only $1.61 a month. That's a subsidy. We sell timber in the Pacific Northwest. Some of these ancient trees have a value-added value of $50,000. We sell them for $1.89 a piece, and you and I pay $250 million a year to the Forest Service to build logging roads for these companies to get up into the last of our forests. All pollution is a subsidy. The kind that we have in the East Coast, General Electric, into the river, it's a subsidy because they're taking public wealth. They're stealing something from the public. When GE dumped its PCBs into the river, it was avoiding one of the costs of bringing that product to market. Proper disposal of that chemical. But when it avoided the cost didn't disappear. They went into the fish. And they put the fishermen out of business. And there's no barge traffic left on the Hudson. It's down 75%. And all these people are going to get sick from the PCBs. And those are going to impose costs on our society. Costs should have been reflected in a free market system in the product that General Electric was producing. But instead, it was able to get hidden subsidies by polluting something that belonged to the public. And the rivers belong to us. That's what the constitutions of our state say. And the fisheries belong to us. They belong to the public. Everybody has a right to use them. Nobody has a right to use them in a way that's going to diminish other people's use and enjoyment of them. But people figure out a way to steal those from the public. And Electric did. It turned the fish in the Hudson into its profit. And then it left the Hudson Valley. And it now, even though the Constitution says we own the fish, it really owns the fish because we can't use them. Pollution is theft, and when the government assists in pollution by dismantling the environmental laws or giving permission to pollute, that's a human rights issue. And that's what the environmentalism is about, human rights. It's about protecting us. And these guys on Capitol Hill say, well, you want to put fish in front of people. That's not what we're doing. The reason we protect nature is not for nature's sake, but what it does for us. Because it enriches us. It enriches us economically, but also culturally and spiritually and aesthetically. We're not protecting these northern forests, as Rush Limbaugh likes to say, for the sake of a spotted owl. We're preserving them because we believe they have more humanity standing than they would have if we cut them down. And I don't spend my time protecting the Hudson River for the sake of the shad or the sturgeon or the striped bass, but because my life is going to be richer, my children's lives are going to be richer. Live in a world and in a community where there are shad and sturgeon and striped bass in the river, and where my kids can see fishermen out on that river who've been fishing that river for 350 years, since Dutch colonial times, and they can see them on the banks repairing their nets, and they can reach out and touch those things, and in that way feel connected to something that's larger than themselves, and feel that they're part of something larger, that they're part of a community. I don't want my children to grow up in a world where there are no commercial fishermen, and where there are no family farms, and where we've lost seasons and the time and the things that connect us to 10,000 generations of human beings that were here before laptops, and that connect us also ultimately to God. And I don't think nature is God, and I don't think we ought to be worshiping it as God, but I think that it's the way that God communicates to us most clearly. I think God talks to us in many ways, each other, through organized religion, through wise people, books, through literature and art and music, but nowhere with such clarity and texture and detail as through creation. And for me...
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Time is up.
Thank you very much.
Vice President Quayle.
Is that for me or him? First of all, I want to just want to make sure, checking out the audience, see where we are. But Jeremy Waddell, thank you very much for that introduction. I think I'm going to take Jeremy on the road with me. But let me share with you an interesting incident that I spoke to about at the banquet earlier this evening, so it will be repetitive for some in this audience. But as I arrived and got to my hotel room, and I opened the door and I walked in, and all of a sudden I looked up and there's this nice basket of fruit there. That's very nice. And attached to that nice basket of fruit was an envelope. And on that envelope it said, Mr. Kennedy. Now, I wonder what Lloyd Benson would say about that. Now, my objective this evening is try to get a consensus on the issue of the environment and the economy. And I hope that we can. I don't want to get into extreme rhetoric. I don't think it's necessary to finger point. We got to sit down and talk about these issues in a serious, productive way. Sure, we have our differences, but if we're going to get up and to call people anti-environmentalists and to call this person extreme and that person something else, it's not going to work. It's simply not going to work. We'll become more polarized on the issue. And in this time, what we don't need is more polarization, we need more consensus. We don't need outrageous and inflammatory language. We need sense and diplomacy and talking to one another. We need common sense, especially when we give the government the power to regulate the environment. The question that we must all ask, is there a better way to do it? A more efficient, productive way to protect the environment? And I think that there probably is. I don't buy into this idea at all. And neither do very many Republicans or Democrats buy into this idea that you have to choose between a growing economy and protecting the environment. There are some on the extreme right that said, no, no, it's just the environment, and there's perhaps some on the extreme right that say, no, no, it's just the economy. But most agree that that is a false choice, that we can have both a strong economy and protecting the environment. But let us not take lightly growing the economy and its importance. If the growth rate in this country was just 1% less each year, for the last 120 years, we would have a third the GDP that we have today. Our GDP would be equivalent to Mexico and Hungary. So economic growth is important, and it is a priority, just like environmental protection. Growth is wealth, which increases the quality of life. Higher quality of living, better schools, better health care, more choices for the consumer, and yes, a better environment. Most Americans, when asked, are they an environmentalist, would say yes. And I would imagine that 100%, 90%, 95% in this room would answer yes. Are you an environmentalist? Of course, we're all environmentalists. We want to preserve or to have clean air and clean water. We want to go camping with our families or hiking. We want to go fishing in clean streams and rivers. We want to breathe the clean air. We want to protect the environment. And I'll tell you, we have, in my judgment, we have made a lot of progress. But there's more work to do. We can't just take the progress that we have made in cleaning up the environment and say, it's over. It's not over. The post-war industrial boom took a heavy toll on the environment. Cuyahoga River, Mr. Kennedy mentioned, I would remember that. Everyone of age, or my age or above, remembers burning by itself, a defining moment. That was in the 1960s and 1970s. A strong consensus emerged from Republicans and Democrats as well that we must do something to protect the environment. And what did we do? At the time Richard Nixon was president, he's the one that created the Environmental Protection Agency. The administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency was my good friend Bill Ruckelshaus, a person with great ability, great intellect, a lot of respect to that position. And we do have a good record when it comes to the environment. But can we do better? You bet. Mr. Kennedy talks about looking at some of the other countries, the former Soviet Union, Eastern and Central Europe, China. What the situation there is when it comes to the environment. A poor record. But each one of these countries that have a very poor record when it comes to the environment have had state-run economies, have had their economy controlled from the state. They didn't have free enterprise. They didn't have markets. As a matter of fact, they don't believe, in many cases, in a market economy. To maintain our concerns and to try to develop a consensus about the environment, let me advance some principles that might unite us. The principle of freedom, the principle of protection of constitutional rights, the principle of common sense, the principle of sound science, the principle of a willingness to change with the times. First, freedom. The freedom to breathe clean air, to drink clean water, to enjoy a clean and diverse environment. Freedom also means that when the government sets standards, let us allow the people try to implement those standards and to achieve those goals. Freedom also brings responsibility. How often do we hear the preachments of responsibility when it comes to crime or welfare? Well, how about personal responsibility when it comes to the environment as well? Personal responsibility says this, that where possible, you have the polluters pay for the pollution rather than have others pay for cleaning up the pollution. The message is very simple. You mess it up, you clean it up, or pay. We should encourage more free enterprise, to have more pro-environmental technologies developed. I happen to serve on the board of directors of U.S. Filter, which is the largest water treatment company in the world. And we're very involved in trying to find new technology. And we are doing a good job. And it's a growing industry. And we're exporting and we're getting into other countries. So we need to encourage that innovation and encourage our businesses to look for better technology to help protect the environment. The idea is the protection of private property rights. The Fifth Amendment. No takings without just compensation. And also, I think that it's time that we focus on regulatory takings as well, where a regulation states the value of one's property. Now, are we talking about big corporations, GE or whoever else you want to throw in there, or the so-called dirty dozen or whatever else you want to throw in there? No. You know what we're talking about on the takings issue? You're talking about farmers, school teachers, small landowners. In many cases, the little guy that can't hire a rich lawyer that knows all the ins and outs of Washington, D.C., or knows how to go into the nearest court and begin the litigation process and to file lawsuits. Maybe they're fortunate enough never to even know a lawyer. Another reason to protect private property rights is to provide incentives to do what is environmentally sound. It's said that if you have a rare mineral on your land, you're lucky. But if you have a rare animal in property, you're unlucky. You know, that ought to be changed. It ought to be both. You don't think someone might tear down some trees or do something if they find that they have a rare animal in fear of the retaliation? That's the wrong incentive to have. Third is common sense. Regulations cost money. Put it out there. It costs money. Environmental regulations, $170 billion a year. That comes down to about $1,800 per household. Like health care, protecting the environment is costly. Fourth, sound science. Not tabloid science, sound science. We want to know what's going on, what are the threats, and what to do about it. Some say, well, just whatever it takes. Well, you know, I heard that argument sitting on the Senate Armed Services Committee when we discussed national security policy. Defense contractors would come in and say, whatever it takes. And we said, no, not just whatever it takes, and we introduced competition. And we have some new procurement laws that affected them, and you know what? We reduced the cost and increased the efficiency. We have good quality when it comes to our armed forces and the equipment that they use, and we're doing it better today because of the introduction of competition, using the markets to do it. Fifth, change with times. Change with times. To paraphrase Lincoln, when a case is new, we must think anew, and we must act anew. We all know about the iron triangle that's out there. the congressional staff, the federal bureaucracy, and all the special interests that lobby the Congress over and over again. But we have to have a willingness to change, and there has been some important bipartisan legislation that has passed the Congress and signed by the President. The Freedom to Farm Act, the Food Safety Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, regulatory exemptions for small business, and congressional regulatory oversight, all passed this Congress. We are a nation of ideas. We are a nation that has a moral purpose. When we face our problems, we face our challenges, and we say that in America, we can do it. We have a history of widening the circle of opportunities to women, minorities, and recently, under the Bush administration, to 40 million disabled Americans. When we are faced with environmental challenges like we were in the 1970s, we met the challenge. But yes, there's more work to do. But perhaps we can get a consensus and have the principles of freedom, property rights, common sense, good science, and flexibility. On the environment, citizens have a right to make a demand of their government. And that demand is, do not allow my family or me to be exposed to unnecessarily high risks. Recognize the dangers and avert them. But secondly, unless a dangerous risk, unless a danger has been recognized and there's no better way to deal with it, don't property. Take away my job. Don't take away my livelihood. Don't take away my freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Quayle. Jennifer Murray will start the first round of questioning, and her first question will be directed to the Vice President.
Mr. Vice President, as you were flying over Oregon this morning, you may have seen Mount Adams, Mount Hood, and Mount St. Helens off the wing of your plane, weather permitting, of course. You also may have noticed the Oregon landscape, which has been scarred by the practice of clear-cutting timber. Clear-cutting of trees causes erosion, including mudslides, which cause irreparable damage to wildlands, rivers, and streams. In recent years, mudslides have blocked major roadways, destroyed homes, and even killed Northwesterners. Biologists have concluded that clear-cutting is a major contributor to the degradation of salmon and steelhead populations. These fish are trademarks of the Northwest for both commercial and sport fishing. Vice President Quayle, given the evidence, is there a viable reason the practice of clear-cutting of trees by timber companies be allowed to continue?
Let's set as a goal to reduce it. To eliminate it and ban it? No, I wouldn't be in favor of that. I've talked with some timber industry folks since arriving in Portland, and I talked to them about this issue. And they were very proud to tell me about what they're doing about it and how they have the goal of reducing it. And I think that we can. And the facts that you point out are important. And it's important to them, it's important to everyone, but yes, we can reduce it, but I don't think we should ban it.
Mr. Kennedy?
Well, I can't say that we should ban all clear cutting. I can certainly say that most of the issues and it sounds good to say that we don't want to ban it, but we want to control it. But look what the Republicans are doing in Congress right now. Look at what happened with the timber salvage bill. We had years of litigation, and we finally reached a summit in 1993 in which we all agreed too much timber had been cut. There was a limited amount left, and we wanted to preserve that amount and allow some cutting of it in order to make the transition to a new kind of economy in Oregon and Washington. And we were going to protect some of the endangered species, and we were going to try to do these objectives. And what happened in Congress, the 104th Congress came in and attached to a bill to give Los Angeles and the victims of the Oklahoma City bombing, so that a bill that President Clinton could not afford not to sign, they attached it to the salvage bill that reopened all those lands that everybody agreed should be protected, once again, to lawless lumbering. So when they say, you know, we don't really want to, we want to limit it, don't tell exactly how they're going to do that. Look at their feet. Don't look at their mouths. Look where their feet go. And where their feet go is very clear. It's lawless lumbering. It's lumbering without law, with no Clean Water Act, with no Endangered Species Act, with no public review, with no litigation. That's what we've got now in the Pacific Northwest because of the 104th Congress.
Well, let me just appraise Bobby Kennedy of the political situation in Washington, D.C. The Republicans control the Congress, and the Democrats control the White House. And if anything is going to get done to protect the environment, it's going to have to take the working of a Republican Congress and a Democratic White House. And I think it might behoove us to talk in terms like that rather than just saying, oh, it's this Republican Congress, because anything that they pass, it can go to your friend Bill Clinton, and he can veto it.
And thank God he did. I mean,
and I'll tell you what, you look at the record that I just talked about of the Republican Congress working with the Democratic president. It's quite remarkable what they achieved in the spirit of bipartisanship. And if you want to talk about Bill Clinton and his environmental record, fine, I'll be glad to talk about that.
Yeah, let me talk about that. You know, I'm not going to defend the Democrats because the Democrats
Well, why not? I have to defend the Republicans.
Well, you're choosing to. I wouldn't take on that job.
I proudly defend the Republicans, starting with Nixon and Bush and all.
I'm not going to defend the Democrats because I think that they haven't been good on the environment either. They have not been anywhere near as protective of the public interest as they ought to be. The whole process, because of campaign contributions, because of our campaign funding laws, because of weaknesses in that, the process...
Oh, boy, this is going to be good.
But I will say this.
Let's talk about this, donations.
But I will say this.
How much does it cost to have that Lincoln bedroom?
Let's finish up this question.
I will say this.
Move on to the next
No, let's
question.
talk about campaign finance reform. That's
in the 104th Congress, you had bills that would literally dismantle every one of our 19 federal major environmental laws. You had Jim Hansen with a bill that would have put 300 parks on the auction block to the highest bidder from the lumber industry, the oil and gas industry, and the mineral industry. We had our public resources being ripped apart, and I can say thank God for Bill Clinton, because if it wasn't for him vetoing these bills, they would have gone through.
Let's move on to the next next question from Dan.
Well, let's
James.
get into campaign finance reform. That
James
sounds like a great topic.
Dan James, his question, Mr. Kennedy, to respond first.
Thank you. Mr. Kennedy, Columbia River salmon runs continue to decline, even though billions of dollars have been spent. The dams, habitat, hatcheries, and fishing are all guilty. Some see dam removal as the silver bullet, but many scientists say that might not work. Salmon provide economic and cultural benefits. Dams provide economic and environmental benefits. These include flood protection, clean, renewable, and cheap hydropower, barging that burns much less fuel than rail or truck, and irrigated crops for export. My question is this: should the dams be removed, regardless of the economic and environmental costs and the scientific uncertainty?
I don't think so. I think that there's some good science that says some of those dams should be removed, and that some of them can be removed without imposing large economic costs on the region. But I'm not against dams per se, and I think that any time that what we have to do is live sustainably, and that doesn't mean we can't change our environment. What it means is that we have to preserve value for future generations, and we have to maximize the preservation of that value. And particularly when you're talking about exterminating species, that's a high cost, because if you just try to evaluate what does that cost humanity, or what's the replacement cost for those species? How much would it cost you to recreate those species? Those are part of the cost-benefit analysis, the rough cost-benefit analysis that has to be done before you make any of these decisions. And environmentalists invented the cost-benefit analysis. We're the ones who invented NEPA. And NEPA doesn't say that National Environmental Policy Act, which was our first major statute, it doesn't say that you can't change the environment. What it says is that you have to look at all of the costs and you have to make a decision based on that. So I wouldn't say, let's go blow up all the dams and cause the kind of disruption to human beings. Ultimately, we're doing this to protect human beings. But we have to assess the richness that the salmon bring them and measure that against the short-term energy benefits or the barging benefits or whatever. We have, on the Hudson River, we have many, many different kind of users. We have barge traffic and we have factories. I don't want the Hudson River to just be a strip of condominiums. I want many, many uses on it. And I think that's what these resources, we have to look at these resources and we try to develop communities and say what's the best way to have rich communities. And I think that clearly to have a salmon population that links us with our history, that you know, as part of our biological history, that's a huge cost to lose, and that definitely ought to be assessed. But I wouldn't say without doing those kind of assessments that we should just go and plow down all of those dams.
Mr. Quayle.
I'm glad to hear him speak about the cost-benefit analysis. I think that's very, very important.
Yeah, but we'd speak a different language on that, because what it means to you is not what it means to me.
Mr. Quayle has the floor.
You know, you want to let me finish, and then you can go ahead and talk about what you mean. I'm just glad to have those words come out of your mouth, to have cost-benefit analysis, you know, be part of your discussion, because we ought to have that more so. As I said, regulations cost. And we ought to look at the cost, and then we look at the social and environmental benefit. And then as reasonable men and women to sit down and having an intelligent discussion, we'll figure out what to do. And the specific answer to the question, no. I don't think you ought to take the dams down without having the science and also to have cost-benefit analysis. It's very important, and it would be very imprudent to do it any other way.
I'd like a follow-up, and this is for both of you. Should species recovery plans require the greatest benefit to species at the lowest cost?
Well, that sounds good. I mean, that sounds good to me. I'll go along with that.
Well, I better not go along with it then. We'll need a different formulation.
We'll move along. Seth Singleton has a question for Vice President Quayle.
Mr. Vice President, the Republican Party promotes a balanced budget and less domestic spending, and has frequently opposed environmental initiatives due to their presumed cost. In some situations, however, damage to the environment actually costs the taxpayers money. To repeat a couple of examples mentioned by Mr. Kennedy, here in Oregon, logging roads are built at taxpayer expense in the national forests so that logging companies can take out the trees they cut. Grazing fees paid by ranchers to the Bureau of Land Management are considerably less than market rates for leasing private land. This, too, is a taxpayer subsidy and a cost to the budget. The question is, in these cases where the budget suffers, would you eliminate the subsidies, charge the logging companies to build the roads, and ask the ranchers to pay market rates, or would you continue present policies?
I wouldn't repeal all the things that you mentioned. I think we'd certainly sit down and take a comprehensive look at it, as the Bush administration did with the Congress. I found of interest that you basically imply that somehow the Bush administration and Republicans are for cutting the environmental budget, if you will, because we're for reduced government spending. Well, let me just point out a couple facts here. I don't want to get facts too much in the way here. In the Bush administration, we increased the funding for EPA. In the Bush administration, we are the ones that increased the National Park Acquisition Program. In the Bush administration, we increased the funding for fish and wildlife, and we also increased the funding for Superfund. Now, the Clinton administration, maybe you ought to direct us to let Bob Kennedy defend Clinton on this. His budget, the first 4 years, he cut the money that the Republicans had put in our administration for Superfund. And yet, in a debate with Bob Dole, I heard it, you heard it, he said that 4 million children live within 1 mile of a Superfund site. That's true. And yet he's the one that cut the funding for it. So I am very proud of what the Republicans and under the Bush administration, especially with the Clean Air Act Amendments, what we accomplished in the name of environmental protection.
Mr. Kennedy?
Okay. Let me answer those points first. First of all, you personally tried to gut the Clean Air Act, the 1990 amendments. You fought against them.
What are you talking about?
The Council on Competitiveness. Let me finish now.
I was there.
You had your
wait a
chance.
second.
You'll have a chance to rebut.
Okay. Kennedy,
Okay, it's my table right now. The Superfund, the question you raised about Superfund was passed. Superfund was a failure during the Reagan and Bush administration. Superfund was one of the last major environmental statutes passed. It was passed in 1981 when Reagan came to office. He hired an EPA administrator named Ann Gorsuch with specific instructions, with Mr. Quayle, with Mr. Bush, excuse me, was at that time, knowledge with specific instructions to destroy the Superfund program. Ann Gorsuch later was held in contempt of Congress for that. Her deputy, Rita Lavelle, was sent to jail, and 23 of their subordinates were fired from the agency because of their efforts to destroy Superfund. During the Reagan and Bush administration, there were very few cleanups done of Superfund. The reason for that was because the three most potent provisions of Superfunds, the demicrobus provision, the small generators provision, and the treble damages provision, were never used a single time during that entire 12-year period when they were in office. As soon as Clinton came into office, he began using those provisions. In his first year in office, he cleaned up 3 times the amount of Superfund sites as the Republicans had done during the previous 12 years. So that's the record. Now, on the other issue of subsidies, this is what environmental injury is about. And you see the same people who are on Capitol Hill today who are saying we're going to get rid of these social programs for the poor. We're going to get rid of the school lunch program. We're going to get rid of Medicaid. We're going to get rid of the aid to students and the aids to our city. They're the same people. They say we're going to end this kind of socialism for the poor. And we're going to free our children from the constraints of public monies. They're the same people who are fighting as hard as they can to preserve $30 billion worth of corporate subsidies to the extractive industries throughout this country. These huge payoffs for lumber, for grazing, for mining. Last year, American Varick, a Canadian company, found $10 billion worth of gold on our federal land. You and I own it in the state of Nevada. They got the whole thing for $5,000 cash. They got the gold, we get the shaft. And those are the provisions, just as hard as they are fighting to end this socialism for poor, they are fighting to keep intact this system of socialism for the wealthy. While they're dismantling the environmental laws that protect the public interest.
Mr. Quayle, you have time to respond.
You know, first of all, you said that I personally tried to gut
the Council on Competitiveness. Do you remember that organization?
Hang on here a second. I didn't interrupt you. You don't interrupt me. Let me tell you a little something about manners here. Now, look. Bear with me. The Council on Competitiveness, which was charged with the oversight on the implementation of the Clean Air Act amendments. What we tried to do was to achieve the cost and regulation at the level, to keep it at a level of $25 billion on an annual basis. And we worked with Bill Riley, and we worked with others to try to make sure that these regulations that were going to be implemented, that there was reasonableness in the costs that are associated with the new amendments that were passed by a Democratic Congress and signed by a Republican president. And that was what we tried to do. It gets into the cost benefit, it gets into the cost of regulation, and we were committed to protecting the environment. Who initiated the Clean Air Amendments? George Bush did. Can't we give George Bush some credit here? George Bush and the Republican administration are the ones that pushed that forward. It didn't come from a Democratic Congress. It came from George Bush's initiative. And so when you say that you tried to gut it, it's just simply not true.
Can I reply to that?
Yes, you started that round, so you have a minute to respond, and then we'll have another question.
When you assessed how much we were willing to spend as a nation on clean air, you said you set a level of $25 billion. How did you reach that level? You reached that level by conspiring with the utility industries, who at that time...
Give me a break.
What was the manners lesson again?
Yeah. Maybe we ought to have a discussion on manners.
Your figures out of the Council of Competitiveness, which were given to you and then repeated verbatim by the utility industry, was that to eliminate a ton of sulfur dioxide to control acid rain, it would cost $10,000 a ton. When we actually passed that it was going to suck the lifeblood out of American industry. When we actually went ahead and passed the 1990 amendments, what we found since then is that it cost $100 a ton. And that's what a cost-benefit analysis does. You have industry figures saying this is going to cost us, and the hysterics from industry saying, repeated by their indentured servants on Capitol Hill, saying, this is going to destroy our nation, it's going to cost us huge amounts of money, and we're going to limit it to $25 billion, but we're going to reach that figure with our figures by saying it's going to cost $10,000 to eliminate a ton of sulfur dioxide. In the end, when we actually forced them to do it, we found out the truth. It only cost $100, and the Clean Air Act has worked.
Thank you. Let's move on to a new question from Jennifer Murray.
Mr. Kennedy, many landowners claim that when government regulations make their land unusable, they should be compensated. For example, if a citizen purchases land with the intent of building a home on it, and the government then declares the property a wetland, the investment value to the landowner is completely lost. Do you believe the government should compensate landowners whenever there is a change in regulation that severely diminishes the value of their property?
I absolutely do not. And the reason for that is if you had to start people, if you had to...
Let's let Mr. Kennedy answer the question.
If we had to pay people to obey the law, government would cease to exist. You can't name me a single law that doesn't diminish somebody's property value. And minimum wage laws diminish the property value of factory owners. Child labor laws diminish their property values. Liquor license laws, anti-pornography laws, airline safety, food safety, even speed limits diminish somebody's property value. If we had to pay people to obey the law, government would simply cease to exist. I'll give you an example. A couple of months ago, Rudy Giuliani, our mayor in New York, passed an anti-pornography statute that said that the porn shops and the peep shows had to locate in certain limited areas of each of the New York boroughs. Well, if he had to confront one of these takings laws, these so-called private property protection acts, he would not be able to close down the existing peep shows in the residential neighborhoods unless he paid the owners the full value of all of their expected profits for all time. Not only that, but every other person who owned an apartment or a piece of land in New York could say, oh, I was just about to start one of those shows in my apartment. You got to pay me too. Government couldn't print the amount of money. And what this really is an attack on government. Every law costs people money. Why are you saying that just because a law is an environmental law that we have to start paying people to obey the law? You don't have a right to use your property in a way that's going to injure the community. We all understand when we join the community, we all understand that when we join a community, that laws are going to impact us in different ways. Zoning laws are going to stop us from building factories. That's a cost. But in the long run, we also understand that although every cost imposes, somebody loses and wins at every law, that in the long run, all of us profit and are enriched as a community. And that's the whole purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy.
If you had to pay people not to pollute, you had to pay people not to dump sewage into waters, not to put toxics into our airs, not to dump toxics into our waterways, or not to fill a wetland. Even if in filling that wetland, you're going to destroy a community water supply, you're going to flood your neighbor's property, you're going to destroy local duck populations and fish populations. Why? That's a nuisance. Communities have never allowed nuisances. The laws from the beginning of time have said that if we discover that a certain thing is a nuisance, we can forbid it, even if we didn't know it was a nuisance before. There's all kinds of laws like that since the beginning of time. When
Thank
we
you,
discover...
Mr. Kennedy. It's Mr. Quayle's turn to respond to that.
You say that this policy is really an attack on government. Now, come on. If a government's going to come in here and, through regulation, declare a wetland and to devalue one's property, that is not an attack on government. That is an attack on people and property. That's what the attack is. And there's something inherent in this discussion that somehow we just don't trust people. I mean, people are really out there just don't care about the environment. People care deeply about the environment. Whatever your political party is, whatever your political ideology is. And the question is, on how are we going to improve the environment and how are we going to protect the environment in the future? I happen to trust people. I think people want to do what is right, that most people act responsibly. And this idea that it's an attack on government, it's basically attacking people and their property. Look what people sometimes do on a voluntary basis. Take Ducks Unlimited. 1994, set aside 50,000 new acres in wetlands. 50,000 new acres. Any credit there? Did it on a voluntary basis. Good people. Good intentions. Cared. Why don't we try to trust people a little bit more?
We got half the wetlands in the United States have disappeared.
Well, Bill Clinton's been president for the last 4 years, so what has he done about it? Bill Clinton, your president's been president for the last 4 years.
He's your president, too.
I want the record to show, if there is any question about this, I voted for Bob Dole and did not vote for Bill Clinton.
He's still your president.
Let's move on to the next question. A new topic from Dan James.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, not that long ago, loggers treated the Pacific yew tree like a weed. Today we know that the bark of the tree yields the breast cancer fighting drug Taxol. Some would argue that without protection of even the most obscure species like the Pacific yew, the world may never discover the next great cure. Isn't that an argument for the strongest possible environmental laws that protect species from extinction?
Well, I think we have a strong environmental law that protects species from extinction. Endangered Species Act. Now, can we take a look at how that applies to contemporary times? Yes. But no. We're going to, we will take each one of those cases on a case-by-case basis, look at the facts, look at the science, look at the benefits, and then make a rational judgment.
But if you looked at the Pacific yew tree before we knew that it cured cancer, the rational judgment would be that it's a trash tree and you can exterminate it. It has no value.
Well, you got new evidence, you got new science, so you better sit down and perhaps come to a different conclusion. How's that?
There's a time problem.
What's the time problem?
If there's no evidence that the tree has value today, if it's just a trash tree, which it was regarded as, and there's no science that says that it has, we don't know if it's going to give us some benefits 20 years from now. That's really the lesson of the Pacific yew tree, that all of a sudden a tree that was regarded as garbage and trash and was moved out of the way of loggers is saving people's lives because of something we didn't know.
So what's your position?
Well,
what's your position?
My position is that the Endangered Species Act, if anything, should be strengthened. What's your position?
I'll tell you what, I am willing to open that debate. And let us have...
We're here.
No, let the Congress get involved in this debate, and you're for opening it up, and I'm for opening up, and we ought to communicate that to Capitol Hill, and we'll have the debate in the Congress, and then your friend Clinton can come in and make a decision whether he wants to sign it or veto it.
But what's your position? Would you like to see it weakened?
I want to see it discussed. I want to see it reformed.
But what's your position?
I want to see it reformed.
Let's go on to the next question. I think the Vice President would like to see the ESA reformed. Seth Singleton.
We've been talking about the environment and the economy as if it were an issue in our domestic politics, which it is. I'd like to move offshore for a moment. Mr. Kennedy, you've been much involved in environmental questions in other countries. I just got back from 2 years in Ecuador, where transnational oil companies pump oil in the Amazon basin. This oil production destroys the rainforest, pollutes the water, and disrupts the indigenous way of life. However, it is the government of Ecuador which promotes all this, because oil revenues are a huge chunk, 35 to 40% of the national budget. Oil pays for schools and health care for poor people and for national defense. Most Ecuadorians think it isn't the business of Americans to tell them how to manage their own resources. They are rather passionate about their national sovereignty, as are Chinese and Russians and just about everybody else, including, I suspect, most of the people here tonight. The question is, what role do you see for foreign environmentalists in these situations? And the real question, isn't it ultimately the right of other nations to manage their own environment in the interest of their own economic and social welfare and development as they see it?
The answer is, of course, it is. I've been involved in international environmental issues, and I was involved in an issue in oil development in Ecuador, in which I represented 7 indigenous tribes down there who wanted to negotiate with an American oil company, Conoco, that was going to do environmentally sensitive, or said that it wanted to do environmentally sensitive and human rights sensitive development of those lands. I think that we have no right as Americans to tell other countries how to manage their own resources. We do have a right, however, to use our power as consumers and to use our foreign aid to give incentives and encouragement to foreign governments to treat their resources well. We can ban imports, for example, of hardwood logs or unsustainable logs into this country, and that's something that I think that we ought to be doing. We can ban imports of wild birds that have been caught illegally. We can use our foreign aid instead of to destroy local environments, which classically we've done, to encourage countries to protect their local environments.
Mr. Quayle.
You have 2 important issues here. One is sovereignty. You simply can't dictate to another country what their laws are going to be. And 2, they'll say, okay, fine, we'll be glad to have better environmental protection. It's going to take this equipment and this technology, and we would like for you to pay for it. Well, as you pointed out in one of your previous questions, there's a balanced budget issue, and we simply don't have the money to clean up the entire world. Now, having said that, I do not think that it would be a good idea to start linking our trade policy to environmental conditions in other countries, and I'll tell you why. Once you start down that road, where does it stop? Once you say, okay, you don't have a cleanup policy, and therefore we're going to not let you import into this country, or we're going to get in, we're going to put on a 30% or 40% tariff. Look, we have enough problem in our country today of trying to promote free trade and trying to promote markets. And if we get in and start worrying about, believe me, you'll find that these imports come in, you'll have this special interest. Talk about special interests. Boy, they'll be up on Capitol Hill saying, you know, that country down there, they don't have a good environment. Let's ban the products of that country coming in here. It's going to benefit them here at home. And I'll tell you who's going to get hurt. The consumer's going to get hurt. And we have got to make sure that we don't get into this protectionism, we don't get into this idea of banning this and linking it to environmental policy or a lot of other things. Because I'm telling you, if you look at the real problem that we're going to have down the road, it is international trade, and to avoid being protectionist, because we got it on your side, we got it on our side, that are clamoring for this type of stuff. We got a guy down there in Texas, Ross Perot. He's very good about talking about these things. We don't need that kind of policy for this country.
Thank you. I'm going to start now to explain how the audience can ask questions. I believe you have cards at your seat, or they will be delivered by the, or picked up by various members of, from Pacific University. So now is the time to see that your questions get down the aisle, and they will be picked up and brought to me here. While we're arranging for that, I have one question I'd like to ask of each of the guests. For both of you, I'd like a response. Our national parks are pressured as never before by a wide variety of users, yet roads and other facilities are not being maintained to earlier standards that made the park something of which most of us were quite proud. In this time of smaller government, what can be done to restore the national park system? Specifically, I'd like to have you talk about how you would balance limits on use with more and higher user fees. Mr. Kennedy?
I think what we should be doing is creating more parkland and protecting more of the lands that we have, the national forest lands, particularly in this part of the country, some of the old-growth forest lands, so that we create, it's a supply and demand question. We ought to be creating more areas for more people to visit. We shouldn't have the only examples of our national heritage that there's a traffic jam like it was, you know, Fifth Avenue at rush hour. It ought to be, you ought to be able to get a wilderness experience, you ought to be able to get a wild experience without having to pay a lot of money for it and without having to encounter a lot of traffic. We're a large nation, we've got lots of federal lands, and we've got lands that we ought to set aside for all of our people to enjoy that kind of experience.
Vice President Quayle?
I would just point out that we did expand the acquisition program for the national parks under the Bush administration without raising the fees or the limitation of its use. I would point out that the question goes to, can you do it? And the answer is yes, we did. And I am strongly supporting, maybe this is, we might agree on something, I don't know, that we ought to continue that acquisition for our national parks and to set that land aside.
And the question of user fees?
We have users' fees. I would not be for increasing.
No increases. Okay. Thank you. Any other panelists have?
Would you be for selling the 300 national parks that James Hansen wants to sell?
No.
In order to
would you?
Bring down the national debt?
No. Would you?
No.
Okay. Hey, we agree. All right, folks.
We agree. Who on the panel has a question while we're waiting for questions to come from the audience? Dan James.
I'd like to explore the issue of the Endangered Species Act reauthorization a little bit more. There are proposals to strengthen the act, and there are proposals to, some would say, weaken the act, others would say to make it more economically friendly. Can either of you think of specific reforms that you would offer, both to protect species and perhaps to get more buy-in or perhaps have more support from the business community?
Do you want me to answer?
Please.
I think that all of our environmental laws ought to be improved by adding additional incentives. All of them, including the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, should include free market incentives so that there's a bottom line on all of them, whether it's endangered species or clean water. In the clean water, for example, we have standards that were developed that don't allow the killing of fish, that make it so that water is supposed to be drinkable and swimmable and fishable, supposedly by 1985. We need to keep those standards intact. We ought to add new incentives that encourage people to go farther than those standards and to use the free market to create those incentives. So people go beyond the existing standards, which are really not only a floor, but they're also become a ceiling because there's no incentive for people to do more. And they can do it, and they can do it efficiently when they want to. We've seen that. The same is true of the Endangered Species Act. I think we need to make it illegal to destroy habitat or to do things that are going to drive a species into extinction or threaten its viability. At the same time, I think we ought to use every incentive possible to encourage landowners with economic incentives to do more than they have to do to preserve these species. Now, Vice President Quayle mentioned that he would like to see a free market kind of reform in the Endangered Species Act. I would like to hear more about that. I think that that's something that's a good idea, but at the same time, I don't want to see the current protections removed while we experiment with this free market reform that I really don't think is going to give us that bottom line protection. I think we need both of those things. And I'd be glad, I think also it's going to cost the government money to do that. And I would like to hear Vice President Quayle's thoughts on that as well, about how much money you want to put aside to save endangered species.
How much are you willing to put aside?
Well, take the military budget and take about 25% of it. All that money you save by forcing the military to go to a free market.
Yeah. Well,
I think that ought to pay for about everything.
Mr. Quayle.
25, let's see, 25, the defense budget is, what it was, about 275, so that'd come out to, what, help me out, 25%, what, 50, $75 billion, is that enough? Yeah, well, let me say this. First of all, it'd be a bad idea to take 25% of the defense budget and put it anywhere. We have today, I believe,
we need some more B-1 bombers.
Hang on here a second. Hang on, you're gonna get some education here.
Star Wars?
Mr. Quayle, you have the floor.
Yeah. There is a false sense of security in the country today that somehow the world is no longer a dangerous place. Because we have statements like, just take 25% of the defense budget, what do you care, it doesn't make any difference. I mean, now if a war would break out or we'd have another Saddam Hussein situation, we couldn't go over there and conduct the operation that we did. Jane's Weekly put out several months ago that we have 73 different flashpoints around the world. 73. Are we going to be the policeman for all 73 incidents? Absolutely not. Where might we be called next? I don't know. But I'm telling you another issue, and that's this whole issue of nuclear proliferation. For some reason, we don't even talk about that anymore. It's as if it doesn't even, it's not on anybody's radar screen. Well, Russia today has about 50,000 nuclear weapons. Do you think that they know where all those nuclear weapons are? Do you think they have the inventory? What if a few of those weapons it gets to a country like in Iran, or in Iraq, or Syria, or Libya, or some other rogue nation? What happens if someplace, someday, someone lets loose one of those weapons of mass destruction? We're going to wake up and say, what happened? Because we're not paying attention to it. National security is an important issue. Fortunately, we are at peace. But we simply can't sit there and say, well, we're just going to take 25% of the defense budget, throw it away. It's too important. We have to preserve our defenses and invest in our national security in this country. That is a priority of any administration.
And you have a follow-up question?
Thank you, yes. For any good law to work, it requires good planning. Planning implies trade-offs. Are there appropriate trade-offs when it comes to protecting the environment? Mr. Kennedy first.
I think, of course, there are. There's trade-offs in any. The environment is a political issue, and it's about how we allocate resources as a people, and those resources are owned by the public, and you can't just say, you know, certainly there's parts of those resources that you put aside and you say they can never be touched for any reason, but most of our resources, for example, the Hudson where I work, it's just it's a study in trade-offs, but all of the trade-offs, the purpose of them ultimately is to preserve the public trust, to preserve the value for future generations, to live off the interest, not go into the capital, and to increase value wherever possible. The same way that small family farmers did what they used to do with their land, which is to try to improve it for the next generation and not mine it. And that's what our objective should be, which is to live sustainably. But it doesn't mean, as I said at the beginning, that you can't change the environment. It's a series of trade-offs, and they're ultimately political decisions.
I agree. There are trade-offs, and they are political decisions, and that's why we have the elected representatives working together, Republicans and Democrats, on trying to figure out the best way to preserve and protect the environment. It is going to take trade-offs. Both sides are going to have to give a little, and we can do both, grow the economy and protect the environment.
The first question from the audience is for Mr. Quayle. I think this follows up on something that you said earlier, that if you want polluters to pay for their pollution, does this apply to small business as well?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
For both of you, should environmental education be required curriculum in primary and secondary schools? Mr. Kennedy?
I don't know. I don't really know. I think that schools, the communities, have to make a choice about what they want to teach. I have, my children go to public school, and I'm involved in their public schooling, and I think that that's really a choice that parents have to make about what priorities their students want to study.
Mr. Quayle?
You're not going to get any debate from me on local control of education. I am all for it.
Another question from the audience. How would you propose to punish companies who have caused irreparable environmental harm?
Make them pay for it. Make them clean it up. Let's get on with the Superfund legislation. Let's get the Superfund, which is set out to clean up toxic waste sites all across America. The Superfund today, what 40% of the costs go to? Lawyers and bureaucrats. 40%. Talk about saving money. If we could save money on the cost of litigation, we might be able to clean up a few more sites and be a little bit more aggressive. And yet it was the Clinton administration that would end up cutting and reducing the funds the first 4 years for Superfund. And we ought to accelerate that and accelerate our cleanup and to get on with trying to reform that system and to get rid of the excessive litigation and the legal costs and get on with the nation's business of protecting the environment.
So the Clinton administration cut the funds, and in 1 year, it cleaned up 3 times the amount of sites that the Republicans had done with all that extra funding in 12 years. That's efficiency.
Just think of how many more sites you could have cleaned up if you didn't cut the money.
It's really a question of enforcement and not money. It's a question of getting the polluters to clean up after themselves rather than having the federal taxpayers put money towards cleaning up after them. And that's what the Clinton administration did.
And I believe that's exactly what I said at the beginning, have the polluters pay, period.
Yeah, but you said that the failure in Superfund was that the Clinton administration cut the budget. But in fact, they did cut the budget. They cut the Superfund, the federal taxpayer contribution to Superfund, and they made the companies clean up after themselves instead, and they made 3 times the amount of companies in 1 year clean up that the Republicans did, that you and George Bush and Reagan did in 12 years.
Mr.
That's
Quayle,
the
one last comment on Superfund, and then we'll move on.
The facts are that the Clinton administration 4 years in a row cut the funding to Superfund. That's a fact. The Bush administration, Do I hear an echo over there?
Let's have another question. Here's something a little bit different from the audience. You both come from backgrounds of inherited wealth. How has this affected your political outlook in general and your views on environmental policy in particular?
You're the one with the inherited wealth. I did. Well, okay. Again, let me just go back to when I got out of the vice president's office, which I declared all my tax returns and everything every year. My income was my salary plus about $15,000 of outside income, which include interest and dividends. I don't believe that is a lot of inherited wealth. That has been with me from the very beginning, and it's simply not the case. So as far as myself speaking from inherited wealth, I can't do that. So you'll have to let Bobby Kennedy talk about it.
Mr. Kennedy.
No, I think what it's allowed me to do is to do what I do, which doesn't pay a lot of money, and to support my family, for me, this is a privilege. I don't look at what I do as a sacrifice or as something that's painful. I love my job, and I love being able to do something that is consistent with the views that I believe in. So I don't think it's affected my views, but it's certainly given me more choices about what I can do with my life.
Thank you. This one also is for Mr. Kennedy. Can you reconcile the Eastern establishment dictating Western land management? Shouldn't regional problems be handled locally?
Yeah, that's a very, I think, a good issue and a difficult issue. For one thing, I think the objective of all environmental policies should be strengthening of local communities and giving those communities as much power as possible. But at the same time, a lot of the resources are community resources. I negotiated over the last 3 years a agreement, really a landmark agreement between New York City and the upstate communities in the Catskills from which New York City draws its water. And I live upstate and I live in the watersheds, and so I naturally want community control. But what the issue was we have a water supply that supplies 10.5 million people with a vital, life-giving resource. The people at the dairy farms in the Catskills said, this water runs through our property. It belongs to us. Therefore, we shouldn't have to control our cows. We should be allowed to let them to stand in the water and drop their wastes in the water. And New York City people said, wait a second, the Constitution of the state says that this water belongs to all of us, and everybody can use it, but nobody has a right to use it in a way that's going to diminish other people's use and enjoyment of it. And nobody has a right to use their property in a way that's going to damage public property or in a way that's going to damage their neighbor's property. And ultimately, a lot of the land out in the western states is owned by the federal taxpayer. The federal taxpayer paid for that land with Louisiana Purchase. It was paid for with their money, and a lot of those lands are public lands, and they're trying to preserve a resource. They have a right to have some say in the preservations of resources that are essentially community resources and offer a huge community benefit. At the same time, the heart of control should be local. But I think that localities, as the localities in the Catskills, really, we could not afford to let them destroy a community water supply that was vital to the state just under the rubric of community control. It also would be wrong to allow people to make very short-sighted decisions about resources in these states that are community resources and vital to our nation without some national voice in the matter.
Thank you. Mr. Quayle.
It should be primarily local control. We want to involve local citizens, involve communities, involve neighborhoods, come to meetings, talk to us about it. You're going to solve these things much more peacefully and reasonably by having the local people participate. And it seems to me so often that those that are the furthest away from resources want to regulate it the most. Those that don't live here seem to know how to come in and tell you how to live and what you should preserve and what you should protect. And I believe that you are the ones that can best make that decision, and that is local control.
Mr. Quayle, this is a question directed to you. How do you feel about U.S. logs, especially from the Northwest, being exported in the raw form and the loss of the lumber industry jobs because of this?
Well, obviously, I want to create more jobs here rather than to see any kind of exportation of jobs, and especially when it goes overseas and I'm told that it comes back in finished goods. I would prefer to see it stay here. Now, the question is, are you going to pass a federal law to prohibit that activity? No. I'm not for changing the federal law on that, but I would like to see it stay here rather than go overseas.
I'd say absolutely we should have a federal law banning exports of raw logs. Listen, there's two ways of creating wealth. One way is through entrepreneurship. The other way is through stealing public natural resources. And we have to distinguish between those two as a nation. We want to encourage entrepreneurship and the actual creation of wealth. But what this is not the creation of wealth. It's just the theft of wealth that belongs to our children. It's somebody robbing the trust that belongs to our children and then sending it overseas without giving anything in return to the communities from which those logs are taken. The communities can't protect themselves because they're dealing with large lumber companies and larger interests that are bigger than they are. And those interests threaten them the same way General Electric threatened us in the Hudson Valley. And so you need a federal law to give the communities the ability to protect themselves.
Okay. I have one last question for both of you before you each have several minutes for closing comments. What is the single most effective thing that any member of this audience, can do as a private citizen and property owner to contribute to a better environment? Mr. Quayle?
Participate in the political process. Come to meetings in your community when these issues are being discussed. Assume more personal responsibility for protecting the environment. And encourage others, your peers, your friends, your neighbors, to be more sensitive to the environment, to conserve more. Be more personally responsible, but be involved. That, to me, is the most important thing. And it's so disconcerting to me, and I think others, to see the drop-off in voter participation. There's alienation in America today. There's cynicism in America today. Too much of it. Why are we cynical? Well, who do you want to blame? Start going around the table. But the fact is, we have too much cynicism today. It's personal responsibility, personal accountability, and putting that priority of protecting the environment where it belongs and doing it ourselves.
Mr. Kennedy, single most effective thing.
I would agree that the single most effective thing people should do at this point is to write their congressman and write their senator and tell them that they do not want the federal environmental laws eviscerated, that they want them strengthened instead. I have enough politicians in my family that I can tell you that writing letters works. The petitions don't always work. The computer-generated stuff doesn't work. But the letters on your letterhead, they really make a difference. The other thing that people should do is to join an environmental group. They should join a local one, like the Willamette Riverkeeper or some other one in this area that's protecting an interest that they feel strongly about. And then they should join a national group, because the real change is going to come on Capitol Hill. And we don't have the money for the big lobbyists. And we don't have the money that the oil industry has, and the chemical industry, and the National Association of Manufacturers. And we don't have the high-powered lobbyists. The only power that we have when we go onto Capitol Hill is people power. We can go in there and say, I represent the 175,000 members of NRDC, and we're going to tell them that you voted against clean air or clean water. And the more people who join groups like that, the stronger that we get. Our initial power came from 20 million people coming out on the street on Earth Day, and we need to be connected to our grassroots. It's the only thing that really gives us political clout.
Thank you. We're at that point now where we're ready for any closing comments you have. You can have up to 3 minutes, and Mr. Kennedy, you may go first.
Well, I think that this is it's an issue that really goes to the heart of who we are as a people. And if you look at American history, what you'll see is there's been a tension from the beginning of the founding of our country between two attitudes. One attitude which was that this country is here to be mined, like the Spanish brought to Latin America, that we're here to just to get the wealth and to go, that this isn't really a nation, it's just a continent, it's just real estate upon which a bunch of strangers have gathered to increase the size of their pile and then move on. There's another, I think, mission that we've had, a kind of counterbalancing mission that we've had since the beginning of our, really the beginning of our national consciousness in this country was a speech that John Winthrop gave to on the deck of the sloop Arbella in 1630, where he said that he told the Puritans as they were coming over here, we're being given extraordinary wealth by God. And we can't use these resources to increase our carnal opportunity, to serve our self-interest, to just make ourselves wealthy. We're being given this to build a community, and it's going to be a city on a hill and an example to all the other nations on earth of what humanity can accomplish if they work together and have a spiritual mission and try to build communities rather than individual self-interest. And the environmental laws really give us a framework for protecting that idea of community. And they say we're here not just to allow people to use their private property to maximize their wealth. That's a good objective, but it's a secondary one. What we're here to do is to build communities. And being part of a community is painful because you can't make decisions based upon your own self-interest alone. You have to account for the other members of your community, and particularly those when you make decisions that allocate resources that we all own in common, the running waters, the air we breathe, the wetlands, the endangered species that since ancient times have been part of the public trust. They were never owned privately. They were always owned since Roman times, and through the Magna Carta and our revolution, they were always recognized to be owned by the public. And the environmental laws give us a framework for protecting those things. And the obligation that we owe to other members of our community is expressed in the term sustainability. And what that means is that God wants us to use the things we've been given to enrich ourselves, to improve our quality of life, to serve others, but we can't use them up. We can't sell the farm piece by piece in order to pay for the groceries. We can live off the interest. We can't go into the capital. We have to preserve value because it's owned not by us, but it's owned by our children. And what environmental advocates do is we use these environmental laws to elbow our way into the courtrooms or into those back corridors of Capitol Hill where the extractive industries, Louisiana Pacific and General Electric, and the mining and the lumber and the chemical industries and the tobacco industries are sitting back there with their indentured servants cutting up the pie that belongs to you and me and that belongs to our children, and the pie of the public trust. And they're saying, here, you take this much for your campaign chest and we'll take the rest in profits. And we elbow our way into those tables and we say, we are emissaries for the future and for people who can't be here today to defend the wealth that they own. And we demand an accounting. We want to know what you're doing with what doesn't belong to you. And the environmental laws give us that power to do that. Because our obligation is not just to ourselves, it's to our communities and to our children. And the environmental laws are the only thing that holds all of that together. It's not going to be done by self-interest. And I'll close with a proverb from the Lakota people that has been expropriated to some extent by the environmental movement, where they said, we didn't inherit this planet from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. And I would add to that that if we don't return to them something that's roughly the equivalent of what we received, that they'll have the right to ask us some very difficult questions. Thank you very much.
Mr. Quayle, the last word is yours.
I hope that we all have gained by this discussion tonight. I hope as we leave here that we are better informed about the choices that you are going to have, about the balance between protecting the environment and growing the economy. But let us also leave mindful and to acknowledge some of the progress that we have made in the area of the environment and protecting the environment. Because it would be erroneous to think or to believe that we haven't made that progress. When we took the fight on in the 70s, we have made tremendous progress. Do we have more work to do? Yes. Are you going to work with us? Yes. Are you going to get into the arena? I hope so, and participate. As students, as community leaders, show up, be counted, let your voice be heard. But we have made progress. Lead has been reduced 95%. Sulfur dioxide, 40%. The ozone has improved 25%. Carbon monoxide reduced 35%. George Bush became president, 110 cities were in non-attainment. Today, that number is below 60. We have made progress. We will continue to make progress. There's tough choices, though. And we have to do it and make those choices based upon sound science. We need to think of the Constitution and property rights, freedom, and trying to do what is in our interest in protecting the environment. I know that you're committed to that. So am I. And so let us join hands as we leave here today in a temporary moment of consensus and maybe unanimity that we can be for both the economy and the environment. There's a lot of work ahead. Let's go out and do it. Thank you very much.
I want to add my thanks to both of our special guests and to my panelists, Seth Singleton, Dan James, Murray, and we are adjourned for the evening. Thank you all.
If you'd like a VHS videotape of this or any other C-SPAN program, call 1-800